Should we go? Yeah. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Was that a beautiful film? My name is Doran Weber. I'm a vice president and program director at the Sloan Foundation. This is our inaugural film with Toronto International Film Festival. We're starting a new partnership with them. And I just want to briefly tell you about who we are, for those of you who don't know us. We're a New York-based nonprofit philanthropy founded in 1934. We make grants for research and education in science, technology, and economics. This is part of our public understanding program where we commission, develop, produce, and disseminate an array of products, books, radio, films, theater, television, new media, all about science for the lay public. We have, our film program is nationwide in the US. We support a dozen film schools. We give annual awards in screenwriting and film production. And we have half a dozen screenwriting development partners like Toronto, including Sundance, SF Film, Film Independent, The Blacklist, Athena Film Festival, and previously Tribeca and the Hamptons. And we're trying to get films that engage with science technology. Now, two films of ours that were made of books that you probably have heard of. One was Hidden Figures, and the other, Oppenheimer, based on a Sloan book, American Prometheus. This film, obviously, is not a science film in the same sense, but it's a film where we think science can shed some light in terms of the biology, the physiology of sex and gender and identity. And our message, if you can reduce it to that, is that science is not the answer, but it's part of the answer. It's the intersection between science and culture where we determine the value that we place on things. And so this is a really, I think, excellent example for it. So with that, welcome. Thank you to everyone at TIFF, and we're looking forward to an exciting panel.
Hello again. Now, I hope you'll join me in welcoming back to the stage writer-director of Fitting In, Molly McGlynn. And also joining us today is Dr. Greta Bauer, PhD, MPH. Dr. Bauer is a professor and director of the Eli Coleman Institute for Sexual and Gender Health in the University of Minnesota Medical School, where she holds the endowed academic chair in sexual health. Now, prior to fall of 2022, Dr. Bauer was a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatics in the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University here in Ontario in London, where she held a sex and gender science chair through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. As an epidemiologist, Dr. Bauer's focus on sexual and gender health has been both substantive and methodological, with a focus on the impacts of social marginalization.
I'm jealous of her bio.
No big deal.
Awesome to be here.
And we'd also like to give a shout out to some groups that are here with us today who are doing amazing work. And they're here with us thanks to support from the Sloan Foundation. So hello to Women's Health and Women's Hands, MRKH Canada, Stella's Place Young Adult Mental Health Centre, and Youth in Science Canada. Hi. So let's get into it. One of the things that I loved the most about this film, and especially with the character of Jax, I found really drew this out, was the emphasis on lived experience as a form of expertise unto itself, and how that type of expertise is juxtaposed with the expertise that we see displayed by a lot of the doctors and medical practitioners in the film. So, Molly, you've spoken openly about how this film draws from your own experience with MRKH. And I was curious, did you consult with scientists and doctors while you were developing the script, or were you mostly drawing upon your own considerable lived experience with MRKH when you developed it?
You know, it's interesting. Like, obviously, I've had MRKH since I was 16, but it just sort of became a repressed thing that I lived with and largely kept private. But when I started writing this script, like anything, you know, I did put research into it, and I learned a lot of things about MRKH. You know, the most interesting thing to me is that, you know, some people consider MRKH intersex, others do not. You know, as you can see from the film, where I stand on it is that you are the only person who can say who they are. And no one can take that away from you. So I very much support however anyone wants to identify. And someone being one thing does not take something away from you. And we did consult with intersex organizations, especially with the character of Jax, played by Kai Griffin. Kai is a UK-based actor. It's only their second role, which is pretty incredible. I did not want to shoot the film without finding an actor who was intersex. And we were coming pretty close to shooting and hadn't found the right person yet. And I posted on Instagram, and Kai put a hand raise emoji and clicked their page and asked Kai to put themselves on tape. And it was an immediate yes for me. That character needed to have joy and confidence and swagger and just be like a hot person that you're just like, you know. And it was important to me that that character, we do understand that they have gone through traumatic things, but it's someone who has moved beyond the trauma and is just a person in their life. And I didn't want to harp on that too much. I wanted that character to be a light to the protagonist of finding joy in yourself despite of the trauma.
Yeah, there was a real, I loved the focus as well on bodily autonomy. I thought that was a really powerful thing in this film. And it kind of gets into, you know, how medical practitioners can support that, or in many cases, unfortunately, not support that. And, you know, some of the things that kind of came to mind for me were Jax refers to feeling like an object of medicine at one point, or even the use of Barbie girl during the examination, another great example of that. So Dr. Bauer, I was wondering if you could speak to how the depictions of autonomy and consent in the film sort of line up with your own observations and experiences in the field.
Sure. So autonomy and consent are slightly different things, right? Consent we often think of as this formalized process, and I love the way you depicted that with in the medical settings, right, where you've got a doctor, the first one who, you know, theoretically asks for consent to have the medical students or residents present, and then ignores the fact that that consent was being revoked, right? So with consent, it's always an ongoing thing. You can always revoke that at any time, and that's true whether it's a medical exam or sex or participation in research. It's always something that's ongoing that you can revoke. And so I thought that was just a really great portrayal of something that is a problem in these settings. I think the issue of autonomy is a bigger issue too, because I guess to fully consent or to have autonomy in these, you also need information. And one of the things that struck me about the film was, and about real life and how this plays out, is the mixing up of medical urgency and social urgency. And so for most people who get an MRKH diagnosis, there's not medical urgency. There will be some exams, but there can be a real sense of social urgency on the part of people who have expectations of what a normal body is, or what kind of things should be done with that body at that point, given that new information about a body that's been going along just fine so far, right? And so that sometimes creates the impression that there's medical urgency. So for somebody who's in a position to have to give consent, if they don't understand that, and they don't understand, you know, what has to happen now and what can happen later, and that ties just back to the final medical scene that you have in there, where you've got the doctor who comes in and says, you know, nothing has to happen now.
I really wish I had your explanation when I was being diagnosed. You know, all this, you know, beautiful information is just something that I was not provided with, and I love the distinction between social and medical urgency.
Yeah, and the idea of what constitutes a normal body. You know, this was one of the other things that really struck me about this film was some of the medical language in the film and the ways that you know, shapes Lindy's understanding of her body. I mean, a term like blind vagina, for example, or, you know, or the use of the word normal to sort of, in some ways, cast Lindy's body as like a problem that needs to be fixed, right? So I wanted to talk about language, medical language, and how it kind of shapes the way that we understand our identities. I don't know if you'd like to.
So you're welcome to go.
I think this is your arena.
This is me. Okay. Yeah. So medical language. I mean, I think it was pretty clear you're trying to capture some of the misogynistic elements in some of that. And so we talk about terms like blind vagina. I like to collect these terms. There's like, you can have an incompetent cervix if you tend to dilate early in pregnancy. My personal favorite is hostile cervical mucus because it makes me, exactly, it's hilarious, right? Like, can you picture mucus being hostile? Well, what does that mean? It means it doesn't welcome and it doesn't kind of preserve sperm. So, you know, if somebody has a cervix, the opening to the cervix can hold sperm for a few days, increases the chance of pregnancy. So why is it hostile? Hostile to who? What does that assume about somebody, whether they want to be pregnant if they have those parts? You know, it assumes that that's a good thing. And so there's a lot of adjectives that are really unnecessarily applied in medical terminology, especially to body parts and processes that are sexed as female. And what does that mean then as somebody who comes into a situation where their body's being talked about in that way? You know, I just read an article the other day on something that I have that's uncommon, and I was like, could deficit be used more often in one article? You know, could you say deficit more often for something that, I just want everybody to know I have a cognitive deficit, okay? So, you know, but the language gets thrown around like it's not people's lives and it's not themselves and it's not their own self-perception and esteem that's being impacted by that.
Yeah, language obviously so matters. I also think we need to afford grace with language sometimes. Sometimes people don't always get it right, whether it be doctors or family or partners or, you know, I can make mistakes sometimes too, but it's like just doing better next time. And if someone says something, just hear them out, apologize, and just change the language to what someone is asking for.
100%. And this idea of hostile mucus and who is it hostile to?
That's a great band name, by the way.
Totally.
Are you starting a band?
We're starting a band.
Yeah, it makes me think about pleasure and the way that the film kind of, you start and end the film with shots of Lindy experiencing sexual pleasure, and yet, you know, something like the dilation process really seems to me, at least as a viewer, seems focused on the pleasure of somebody who isn't Lindy, right? It's like, you know, what we know about sexual pleasure for people who have vaginas, a lot of it doesn't actually come from the internal stimulation. And so, yeah, I wanted to talk about the role that pleasure sort of played for you in developing Lindy's character and journey.
Yeah, we see Lindy, the beginning and the end of the film are always very clear to me. The beginning is, you know, a male point of view fantasy of her, and then the end is her own gaze. So from being viewed to self-view is the journey of the film. If you don't know anything that happens in between with those two images, you can kind of understand the character journey. And in the beginning, we see that this is a girl who's able to access pleasure, and then it goes away. And it becomes mechanical, prescriptive, using other people, and then the fact that she reclaims it at the end is getting back to where she was before it was taken away.
Is there anything you wanted to add, Dr. Bauer, about?
No, nothing to add to that.
Okay. So the film also makes what I considered some really interesting observations about the genders of the doctors themselves, the medical practitioners, and how that kind of shapes their approach to the patients. So, you know, for example, the idea that like that MRKH is named after 4 male doctors who quote unquote discovered the condition, right? Or the tearful glance that Molly exchanges with the woman resident during the
Maddie, but me in spirit.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, thank you, sorry. She looks so much like you.
I've heard that. It's a really nice compliment that I don't see, but thank you.
Yeah, so, I was wondering, Molly, if there's anything in particular that you hope doctors and medical practitioners are taking away from this film when they watch it.
Obviously, Dr. Doheny is a sort of comical exaggeration of a doctor. There are plenty of incredible doctors of all genders. I've had great doctors who are men, the doctor who diagnosed me when I was 16, he's based on her. It was a woman. So, but, you know, the medical system is patriarchal in nature, and women can, you know, function under that system as well. So, though she was a woman, some of the things she said to me were extremely damaging and affected the trajectory of my life in ways that I only understood until making this film. So I'm not necessarily trying to say male doctors are bad. You know, that's not what I'm saying. Just an exaggerated version to sort of a comical degree. Although the line that he says, you know, if dilation is not working for that whole conversation, and he says you can practice with your boyfriend unless he's well endowed. That's more or less what my doctor said to me when I was 16. And my little pea brain that hadn't like fused, you know, the parts of the brain, but prefrontal cortex, all that said to me, it was like, get a boyfriend, you know? And it was like the programming was put there in a way that was very damaging.
This goes back to the autonomy part, right? About you being put in that position when the focus wasn't on what you wanted. If you knew what you wanted sexually, what was important to you about your body, you know, just the assumption that you were going to have a boyfriend, that was the kind of sex you were going to want to have, whether you wanted it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the dilation process, like it seemed kind of designed to give Lindy the option to have this sort of quote unquote like normal sexual experience. And the film it's so nuanced because I felt I had this sense of Lindy's understandable grief at not being able to experience these sort of you know, quote unquote normal experiences, like borrowing a tampon from another woman or something like that. And you know, I'm curious, what do you think it would look like for medical science and also just like society at large to create the space to support Lindy in actually embracing her body as it is?
I think it's just around education and sexual education in general. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a 16-year-old wanting to use dilators or get surgery or whatever their plan of action is, but those are one part of it. But it's like someone talking about sexual pleasure and explaining that, you know, your job is not to be a vessel to someone else's pleasure. B, you have complete access to it, you know, and that does not go away. And it, to me, it's just like culturally, I don't know, I live in the US now, but it's like sex is so fear-based, and it's don't do this, don't do that, instead of giving teens education about what pleasure is. And, you know, that we just don't know our bodies, and especially teen girls, and like, why don't teen boys know that, you know? And like, and it extends beyond boys and girls. Like there's, you know, a whole spectrum in the middle, but, you know, pleasure is somehow taboo still. And yet we seem to all be wanting that, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, agreed. I'd love to see if we have any questions from the audience. Put your hand up there. I think I see a hand in the front here.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to repeat the question for anyone who didn't hear. The question was that the audience member appreciated how the film sort of gestures toward the potential for self-harm for young women in these situations, but doesn't get too graphically into it. Molly, can you speak to that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. You know, it's a really difficult subject matter. to discuss, and it can be triggering to people. I have struggled with all sorts of self-harm in my life. And in the script, there was a scene that kind of went farther with that moment. You noticed that we didn't have time to shoot, but ultimately I'm glad that we didn't shoot it, because I just think the insinuation in the gesture of digging her nails into her wrist was enough. And from my point of view, that's someone who's reacting in a way, and that gesture is through pain. We are getting a sense of our bodies and that we're alive, and it's a attempt to ground yourself that's misfired. And yeah.
I think we have time for one more quick question, if you can keep it quick. And I saw a hand there. Yes. So the question was about the connection between Lindy's MRKH diagnosis and her mother's experience with breast cancer, and sort of where the inspiration for that came from.
The character is definitely inspired by my relationship with my mother. When I was 13, she was first diagnosed with breast cancer, and I always say that when I was getting breasts, she was getting hers removed. And it was very quickly seeing that bodies were a bomb waiting to go off, for me, at least a woman's body. And then a few years later, I was diagnosed with this, and she passed away a couple weeks after I graduated university. That was really hard, and this script, in a way, is an amends to her and our relationship, and in particular, there was one day when I was 16, 17, when it was this period of my life that was very hard, and pain can manifest as being selfish if people don't really understand what's going on, and I was really self-focused on my pain, and my mom was, single mother. I was the youngest of 5 daughters, put herself through college, night school, and she was very gentle and kind and loving. But I remember she sat down at the end of my bed one night, and it was very shocking. That scene happened, basically, and she pulled down her shirt and showed me her scar, and she said, "You don't get a monopoly on pain." And that always stuck with me, and it snapped me out of my own, pain cycle, which again can seem selfish, but sometimes it just is when someone is really suffering, they can't see beyond it, and I think she was trying to pull me out of that. Unfortunately, she's not here to see this film, but it's hard to, she really was there through all of it. And the night we wrapped, it was a blue moon, and I realized it was the 15th anniversary of her death that night, so the timing lined up.
What a beautiful tribute. Well, I think that's all we have time for, and I'm crying, so thank you all for coming, and thank you, Molly and Dr. Bauer, so much.
Thank you so much. Tell your friends to watch it in movie theaters in November.
So excited
Thanks,
for
Dr.
that.
Bauer.
Thank you.